Hello YouTube and welcome back to another sensor spotlight. Today we're going to be looking at the joystick sensor. So again, before we get started, if you have not seen the always sensor spotlight, go and check that out because we are going to be basing this tutorial off of that one. Okay, so what does the joystick sensor do? Well, it detects joysticks, or gamepads that you plug into your computer. So for today, I'm going to be using a PlayStation 3 controller as an example, but steering wheels, flight sticks, Xbox controllers, anything like that will work as well. Some of the settings might be just a little bit different though. So as an example here, I have this cube and it's just simply going to move up on the Z-axis whenever I push up on axis number 1 on my joystick. So if I play the game and push up on that axis, in this case it is the left joystick pushing up, and that makes the cube go up. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the joystick sensor now. Okay, so here we are looking at the joystick sensor. You'll notice, again, we have all of the same buttons as the always sensor, and those all do the exact same thing as they do on the always sensor. And then we have a whole bunch of options down here now. So, starting off, we have index, and that is a number between 0 and 7. And that is which joystick you want to look at. You can plug in up to 8 joysticks and read them all individually. And this index number is which one of those joysticks you want to read. So 0 will be the first joystick, 1 will be the second, 2 will be the third, and so on and so forth. So next is the event type, and you have a choice between button, axis, hat, and single axis. So starting with button, what this does is it sets the sensor to positive and triggers the controller whenever a button is pressed. Now with button event type selected, down here we have a new option, and that is button number. And like the tools tip says, this is which button to use. So you may have to do some experimenting with your joystick to figure out which button number is which, especially for something like the PlayStation 3 controller, which doesn't have button numbers on the labels. And this here is an option between 0 and 18, so it supports up to 18 buttons. So for the next event type, we have axis, and this is reading one of the axis values on the joystick. So for instance, it could be a joystick, it could be a slider, anything that sort of has a variable value. So with axis mode selected, we have a couple of different options here. We have axis number, which is which axis you want to look at. That is a number between 1 and 8. This is where you would choose, for example, left joystick going up and down, or left joystick going left and right, or for a PlayStation 3 or Xbox controller, the triggers, or other sliders or stuff like that. Next to that, we have axis threshold, and this is a deadband. Whenever you let go of the joystick, normally it will not snap back to a perfect 0 value. So in our example, if I set this threshold down to 0 and I play the game, you see the cube starts going up. I didn't touch anything there. And that's because while it may seem like it's at 0, it's not quite at 0. So what this threshold does is it creates a circle around the center of the joystick where the joystick will read no value. And this one is a value between 0 and 32,768, which is the maximum value on the joystick. So for instance, a threshold of 2,000, it will wait until the axis reads a value greater than 2,000 before it triggers the controller. So then if we go back to our example and I play the game, I'm not touching anything and nothing's happening, which is exactly what we want. But whenever I push the joystick up, cube moves. Okay, and down below we have axis direction. We have a selection of right axis, up axis, left axis, and down axis. And this is choosing the direction that you will need to move the joystick in order to trigger the controller. So for this example, I've chosen the up axis, so whenever I push up on the joystick, the cube will move. Okay, on the next event type, we have hat. You can choose a different hat number here. You can choose between 1 and 2. You can also choose the hat direction, and you have a lot of options here. You have basically up, down, left, and right, and all of the corner directions as well. So up, right, down, left, up, left, and down, right. So the next event type that we have is the single axis, which is basically the same as axis, except it does not contain the added options of choosing the direction or the all events selection. So for single axis, you have axis number between 1 and 16, and you also have axis threshold. Whenever we have the all events toggled on, that means that any axis event will cause the sensor to go positive and the controller to be triggered. Okay, so that's a look at the logic brick. So now we're going to step over into Python and look at some of the multiple attributes over there. Okay, and here we are in Python. I am sorry if it doesn't flow correctly with the first tutorial, but this has been recorded a full week after recording the first part, so hopefully all of the audio is okay. So we're just going to continue on. You can see we get the sensor the same way as all of the other sensors. We also have multiple sections of attributes this time, one for each of the different sensor modes. We're going to start off with the configuration attributes. There is one that is used in all of the different modes, and that is index, and that is just exactly the same as setting the index number on the sensor. So you can set or read this, so I could read this to a variable to figure out which index that joystick is, and I might want to use that for if I'm trying to figure out which player this joystick is meant to be controlling. So moving on to just the axis mode variables, we have axis, and this either sets or gets a list containing the axis and motion that the sensor is looking for. So this is the same as choosing an axis number and choosing the direction that the axis needs to move. Now the motion is represented as a number. If you want to see which direction is represented by which integer, you can check that out in the link in the description. Next we have num axis, and this returns how many axes are on the current joystick. So, for instance, on the PlayStation 3 controller, there are 5 different axes. There is up and down on the left joystick, left and right on the left joystick, up and down on the right joystick, left and right on the right joystick, and finally the triggers. So if I was using a PlayStation 3 controller, this would return 5 axes. So next we have threshold, and this again is exactly the same as setting the axis threshold on the sensor there. Moving on to button mode, the first attribute we have is button. This is just setting what button the sensor is looking at. So if we go to the sensor, switch to button, it's the same as setting button number here. Next we have num buttons, and num buttons is the same as num axes. It just returns how many buttons are on the joystick. Moving on, we have hat mode. The first attribute for that is hat, and this either gets or sets a list containing the hat index and the motion that the hat is looking for. So again, the motion is represented as an integer, and again, that is the same as if we go into hat mode, we choose the hat number and the hat direction. So again, if you want to see which directions are represented by which integers, there is a link in the description for that. So next we have num hats, and again, the same as num buttons and num axes. It is just simply returning an integer representing how many hats are on the joystick. So moving on, we have status attributes, And first, we're going to start off with the axis mode again. And really, the only unique status attribute is axis values. And this returns a list containing all of the axis values read from the joystick. So, for instance, on the PlayStation controller, it would return a list containing 5 integers. The first one would be up and down on the left joystick, the second one left and right, third one would be up and down on the right joystick, the fourth one would be left and right, and the fifth one would be the trigger value. Next up, I believe we have our first function in this series. We have get button active list, and this returns a list of buttons that are active. So for instance, if I was pressing the first and second button on my joystick, this would return a list containing 1 and then 2. So next we have get button status, and this is just simply returning the status of the button that we pass into the parameter field here, and that's going to return a boolean, so it's going to return either true or false. And so in this example, if I was pressing button 0, it would return a true. If I was not pressing button 0, it would return false. And finally, we have hat mode. And again, really the only useful attribute here is hat values. And this one is simply returning the value that the hat is currently reading. So for instance, whenever the hat is centered, this would return a 0. And I believe whenever you are pushing up, it usually returns a 1. And then from there, it kind of varies depending on what type of hat your joystick is using and how they have it set up. So you may need to experiment with that just a little bit. All right, so that is a look at the joystick sensor and some of the attributes you might want to use for it in Python. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section down below. If you would like to suggest a future tutorial, there is a link in the description. There is also a link in the description with all of the attributes that this sensor has, as this tutorial really only covers what I think are the useful ones. So, next time we're going to be looking at the keyboard sensor. But until then, I want to thank you guys very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.